The tribunal chamber stretched endlessly into darkness, its crystalline walls pulsing with the cold light of 1,000 dying stars. Here, in the heart of the Galactic Confederation's most sacred sanctum, the fate of an entire species hung in the balance like a planet caught between binary suns. The accused stood in perfect silence, their forms ethereal yet substantial, beings of pure consciousness wrapped in bodies of living light that seemed to flicker with the weight of their shame. They had once been gods among mortals, the Zephyrians, a species that had transcended physical limitations millennia ago. Their consciousness evolved beyond the need for crude matter, existing as pure thought given form. Their civilization had spanned 12 galaxies, their influence touching every corner of the known universe. They had been the shepherds of cosmic order, the arbiters of justice, the guardians of lesser species who still crawled through mud and darkness, seeking meaning in their brief, fragile existences. But power, even cosmic power, corrupts absolutely. The very perfection they had achieved became their downfall. In their transcendence, they had lost touch with the fundamental truth that strength comes not from the absence of weakness, but from the courage to confront it. They had become complacent, soft, believing themselves immune to the very forces that had once driven their evolution. The first signs of decay had been subtle, a reluctance to intervene in galactic conflicts, a growing isolation from the species they had sworn to protect. Then came the great abandonment, when they retreated to their dimensional citadels while entire civilizations burned in wars they could have prevented with a mere thought. The Andromedans fell to plague. The silicon-based Christek were exterminated by nanophage swarms. The peaceful Luminar were enslaved by mechanical intelligences that the Zephyrians could have reprogrammed in microseconds. Each tragedy was a test they failed, each moment of inaction a betrayal of their cosmic duty. The universe watched in horror as its greatest protectors became its greatest disappointments. The Confederation had no choice but to act. High Arbiter Kethmore, whose own species had crawled from the radioactive ashes of their homeworld to achieve greatness through suffering, stood before the accused like judgment incarnate. His voice resonated through dimensions when he spoke, carrying the weight of cosmic law and the pain of betrayed trust. Zephyrians of the 12 realms, he intoned, his words causing the very fabric of spacetime to vibrate with authority, you stand accused of cosmic dereliction, of abandoning your sacred duties as protectors of the weak and guardians of the innocent. Your transcendence, once a beacon of hope for all conscious beings, has become a monument to cowardice and neglect. The lead defendant, once known as Supreme Consciousness Velthara, flickered like a candle in a hurricane. Her voice, when it came, was barely a whisper across the cosmic winds. We evolved beyond the petty conflicts of lesser beings. Our consciousness expanded beyond such primitive concerns. Primitive? Kethmore's laugh was the sound of colliding galaxies. You speak of the very struggles that forged your strength as primitive? The pain that taught you compassion? The weakness that showed you the value of growth? In your quest for perfection, you forgot that even gods must remain servants to something greater than themselves. Around the tribunal chamber, representatives from 1,000 species bore witness to this cosmic trial. The warrior poets of Vega Prime, scarred from countless battles yet still fighting for justice across their sector. The hive-mind collective of the Spiral Arms, who had learned to balance individual consciousness with collective responsibility. The machine prophets of the Iron Nebula, artificial beings who had chosen to serve life rather than replace it. All had faced their own moments of weakness and emerged stronger. The sentence has been decided, Kethmore announced, his words echoing across dimensions. You who have forgotten the value of struggle shall be reminded. You who have abandoned the weak shall become weak yourselves. You are hereby stripped of your transcendent forms and banished to the most dangerous frontier in the known universe, the Sol System, where a young species called humanity struggles for survival on the third planet from their star. The collective gasp from the accused was like a solar flare across space. To be forced back into physical form, to be reduced to the level of the very beings they had dismissed as primitive, it was a fate worse than death for creatures who had existed as pure thought for eons. You will live among them, Kethmore continued relentlessly. You will share their limitations, their mortality, their pain. You will learn again what it means to be weak, to struggle, to depend on others for survival. And, perhaps, if you prove worthy, you may yet rediscover the strength that once made you great, not the strength that comes from power, but the strength that comes from overcoming powerlessness. Supreme Consciousness Velthara tried to maintain her dignity even as cosmic forces began to compress her ethereal form into something more solid, more vulnerable. And if we refuse this sentence? If we choose destruction over degradation? Then, you will confirm what we already suspect, Kethmore replied with infinite sadness. That you are already destroyed, and we are merely making it official. The choice, as always, is yours. The transformation began immediately. Across the tribunal chamber, the mighty Zephyrians felt their consciousness compressing, their perfect forms becoming dense and limited. Where once they had been beings of infinite possibility, they were now trapped in crude matter, subject to physics and chemistry and all the messy realities of biological existence. As the cosmic winds of banishment began to swirl around them, carrying them toward their primitive destination, Velthara managed one last question: why Earth? Why humanity? Of all the species we could have been sent to aid? Kethmore's answer followed them into exile like a prayer and a curse, because they are everything you have forgotten how to be. Weak enough to know their limitations, strong enough to exceed them. Mortal enough to value life, brave enough to risk death for others. They are not perfect, they may never be perfect. But they are growing, and, in their growth, perhaps you will remember what yours was supposed to become. The last thing the Zephyrians saw before the cosmic storm engulfed them was Kethmore raising his hand in what might have been blessing or farewell. Around him, the representatives of 1,000 species watched in silence as the once mighty guardians of the galaxy tumbled through space and time toward their new home, toward a blue-green planet where their real test would begin. As they fell through dimensions toward Earth, their new bodies already forming around their compressed consciousness, the Zephyrians began to understand the true horror and hope of their sentence. They would not merely live among humans, they would become human, with all the terror and beauty that entailed. They would know hunger and thirst, pain and pleasure, love and loss, hope and despair. They would face every day not knowing if they would see another, and, in that uncertainty, they might finally discover what they had lost in their quest for cosmic perfection. The irony was not lost on them. They who had sought to transcend weakness would now be defined by it. They who had abandoned responsibility would now depend entirely on the mercy of the very type of beings they had failed to protect. They who had believed themselves beyond the reach of destruction would now face it every moment of their mortal lives. But, as they hurtled toward their new existence, something unexpected stirred within their compressed consciousness, not regret, but curiosity. What was it like to truly struggle? What was it like to overcome obstacles not through cosmic power but through determination and will? What was it like to find strength not in perfection but in the very imperfections that made existence meaningful? Soon, they would find out. Soon, they would learn whether a being who destroys his weak self can truly never be destroyed by others, or whether strength comes from embracing that weakness and transforming it into something greater. Part 2, The Weight of Flesh. The first sensation was cold, not the abstract concept of coldness they had observed from their dimensional citadels, but the brutal, immediate reality of frozen air cutting through inadequate clothing and into skin they were still learning to inhabit. Former Supreme Consciousness Velthara opened eyes that were no longer windows into infinite dimensions but simple biological cameras, limited and crude and painfully, beautifully real. She found herself in what her newly acquired human memories told her was called an alley, surrounded by brick walls stained with years of urban decay and the accumulated desperation of countless forgotten lives. The smell hit her next: exhaust fumes, rotting garbage, human sweat and fear, all mixing into a symphony of sensation that her transcendent form had never experienced. It was overwhelming and nauseating and, somehow, inexplicably, alive in a way that pure consciousness had never been. Around her, scattered like discarded refuse, lay her fellow exiles. Former cosmic guardian Zarkath was curled in a fetal position beside a dumpster, his new human form racked with shivers as he experienced cold for the first time in millennia. The body he now wore was that of a man in his 30s, unremarkable in every way except for the eyes that still held depths that spoke of cosmic knowledge, now trapped behind the limitations of flesh and bone and human comprehension. "This cannot be happening," whispered former High Counselor Nixala, her voice hoarse with the unfamiliar mechanics of vocal cords and larynx. She had been transformed into a middle-aged woman, her human form bearing the subtle signs of a life lived under stress: graying hair, lines around the eyes, hands that showed the wear of labor she had never actually performed but somehow remembered. "We are beings of pure thought. We transcended matter. This is impossible. But, former strategic consciousness Torvash, now wearing the body of a young man barely past adolescence, was already struggling to his feet with the stubborn determination that would prove to be their salvation. Impossible or not, it is our reality now. We can either accept it and adapt, or we can lie here and die. And something tells me that dying in these forms won't return us to our previous existence. The truth of his words settled over them like the dawn that was beginning to creep across the sky of this alien world. They were trapped, not just on Earth, but in humanity itself, subject to all the biological imperatives and limitations that came with these crude vessels of flesh and blood and fragile bone. Velthera forced herself upright, her new body protesting every movement with muscles that ached and joints that creaked and a back that seemed determined to remain bent despite her will. The simple act of standing required more effort and concentration than reshaping galactic clusters had once demanded. But, as she gained her feet and looked around at her fellow exiles, she began to understand something that their cosmic existence had never taught them: that difficulty was not the enemy of achievement but its most faithful companion. "Where are we?" Nixala asked, though the question was rhetorical. Their new human minds, somehow programmed with the basic knowledge necessary for survival, had already supplied the answer. Detroit, Michigan, United States of America, Earth. A city that had once been the industrial heart of human civilization, now struggling with decay and abandonment and the endless cycle of renewal that seemed to define human existence. More importantly, Torvash said with the pragmatism that would soon become their lifeline, "What are we?" These bodies come with identities, with histories, with documentation that says we've always been human. The Confederation was thorough in their punishment. It was true. Somehow, impossibly, they had not just been given human forms but human lives. Velthera was now Sarah Chan, a social worker whose previous life included memories of college, of family dinners, of heartbreaks and small triumphs that felt as real as anything from her cosmic past. Zarketh was Marcus Williams, a construction worker with calloused hands and a mortgage he couldn't afford. Nixala had become Dr. Elena Vasquez, a physician whose career had been dedicated to healing the very type of suffering their species had learned to ignore. The others were equally transformed cosmic beings squeezed into human shells, forced to navigate a world where they were no longer gods but simply another face in the crowd of 8 billion struggling souls. They had been scattered across the city, their cosmic consciousness somehow knowing that they needed to find each other while their human minds struggled with the logistics of existence in a world where nothing was given and everything had to be earned. Over the following days, they began the long, humbling process of learning to be human. Sarah Chen reported to a job at an underfunded community center, where she discovered that being omniscient meant nothing when faced with a single mother of 3 who needed help finding housing in a system designed to keep the poor invisible. Marcus Williams showed up at a construction site where cosmic knowledge of physics and engineering meant nothing when his soft, untested hands couldn't grip a hammer properly and his inexperienced muscles screamed in protest after an hour of real labor. Dr. Elena Vasquez found herself in the emergency room of a hospital that served the city's forgotten neighborhoods, where her vast understanding of cosmic biology was useless when faced with a gunshot victim bleeding out on a gurney while she fumbled with the unfamiliar weight of human medical tools and the crushing pressure of time measured not in eons but in heartbeats. The transformation was brutal and complete. These beings who had once commanded the respect of galaxies now struggled with the simple act of buying groceries with money they didn't have, navigating public transportation systems they didn't understand, trying to sleep in beds that felt alien when they had spent millennia existing without the need for rest. But it was in that struggle that the first seeds of their redemption began to grow. Sarah Chen, overwhelmed by the chaos of her first week at the community center, found herself staying late one evening to help a teenager whose father had been deported and whose mother worked 3 jobs just to keep their family from homelessness. As she sat across from this young human, listening to a story of hardship that made cosmic tragedy seem abstract by comparison, she began to understand something that transcendence had never taught her. This wasn't about solving problems with infinite power, it was about showing up, day after day, in the face of impossible odds and offering whatever small help you could provide. It was about being present for suffering that couldn't be fixed with a thought, being witness to pain that couldn't be erased with cosmic intervention. Marcus Williams made his own discovery on a construction site where he was laying foundation for low-income housing. His initial fumbling with tools and technique had earned him nothing but frustration and the barely concealed contempt of his foreman. But, as weeks turned into months, as his soft hands developed calluses and his weak muscles grew strong, he began to understand the profound satisfaction that came from building something with your own labor, something that would shelter families who had nowhere else to go. You know, his supervisor told him one day as they watched a young couple walk through their new home for the first time, their faces bright with hope and gratitude, this job ain't about the money. Money's shit anyway. It's about this, watching people get something they never thought they'd have. Makes all the aching backs and split knuckles worth it. Marcus nodded, feeling something stirring in his chest that he didn't recognize at first. It was pride, but not the cosmic pride he had known as Zarketh. This was smaller, more personal, and somehow infinitely more meaningful. He had helped build this home with his own hands, his own sweat, his own growing understanding of what it meant to create something useful rather than simply commanding its existence. Dr. Elena Vesquez faced her moment of revelation in the middle of her third month on Earth, during a particularly brutal night shift that saw her treating everything from overdoses to domestic violence to the simple wear and tear of poverty on human bodies. She was exhausted, her human form demanding sleep that her cosmic consciousness insisted was unnecessary, when the ambulance brought in a 7-year-old girl who had been hit by a drunk driver. The child was dying. Elena could see it in her human medical training, could feel it in the cosmic knowledge that still echoed faintly in the corners of her compressed consciousness. In her previous existence, she could have healed such injuries with a thought, could have reached across dimensions and simply erased the trauma from reality itself. But now she had only her hands, her training, her determination, and the support of a medical team that had spent years learning to fight death with nothing but skill and stubborn refusal to give up. For 6 hours, they worked over that little girl, their human limitations forcing them to be creative, to be resourceful, to be better than their individual abilities should have allowed. When the child finally opened her eyes and whispered for her mother, Elena felt something she had never experienced in all her eons of cosmic existence, the profound satisfaction that comes from earning a victory rather than commanding one. She had not saved this life through transcendent power but through learned skill, collaborative effort, and the kind of determination that only comes from knowing that failure means something irreplaceable will be lost forever. As the months passed, the exiled Zephyrians began to find each other again, drawn together not by cosmic consciousness but by the simple human need for connection and understanding. They met in Sarah's community center, in the small apartment Marcus was learning to call home, in Elena's kitchen where she was discovering the strange comfort of cooking meals for friends who needed the nourishment. "We're changing," Torvash observed one evening as they shared a dinner of rice and beans that somehow tasted better than the ambrosia they had consumed in their dimensional citadels. His human form had filled out from months of working in a homeless shelter, his soft academic features hardened by the reality of dealing with addiction, mental illness, and all the ways that human society could fail its most vulnerable members. "No," Sarah corrected, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that provided warmth she was learning to need and appreciate. "We're remembering. We're becoming what we were supposed to be before we forgot that strength comes from struggle, not from its absence." They were beginning to understand that their banishment was not punishment but opportunity, a chance to rediscover the very qualities that had made them worthy of transcendence in the first place. In learning to be weak, they were learning to be strong. In accepting limitation, they were discovering possibility. In embracing their humanity, they were finding their way back to the cosmic consciousness they had lost. But their real test was yet to come. For in a universe where even gods could fall, there were forces stirring that would require everything they were learning about human strength and courage. The galaxy they had abandoned was about to remember why it had once looked to Earth as the crucible where true heroes were forged. Part 3, The Crucible of Redemption. The first signs appeared in the night sky over Detroit 18 months after the Zephyrians' exile began, subtle distortions in the stars that only eyes trained in cosmic awareness could detect. Saracen noticed them first, during a late evening walk through the neighborhood where her community center served meals to the homeless. The constellation of Orion flickered, just for a moment, as if reality itself was stuttering. "Did you see that?" she asked Marcus Williams, who had joined her for the walk after his construction shift. His human body was tired, muscles aching from 12 hours of manual labor, but his spirit was stronger than it had ever been during their cosmic existence. Marcus followed her gaze upward and felt his blood freeze in ways that had nothing to do with the Michigan winter. The distortion was growing, rippling outward from a point in space that their human eyes couldn't quite focus on, but their compressed cosmic consciousness recognized with terror. The Devourers, he whispered, the name pulling itself from memories of the very threat that had once made their protection of the galaxy necessary. They've broken through the outer barriers. Dr. Elena Vasquez's phone buzzed against her hip as she finished her shift at the hospital. The message was simple, coded in the subtle patterns they had developed for communication: emergency gathering. The children need us. Within hours, all 12 of the exiled Zephyrians had assembled in the basement of Sarah's community center, their human forms gathered around a table that had once hosted support group meetings and homework sessions. The irony wasn't lost on them. They who had once commanded cosmic armies were now meeting in the same space where teenage mothers learned parenting skills and recovering addicts shared their struggles. Torvash, now known to his human colleagues as Dr. Thomas Vance, spread star charts across the table with hands that shook not from cosmic power but from very human fear. The containment fields we established around the dark sector are failing. The Devourers have already consumed 3 star systems in the outer rim. The Devourers were entropy-given consciousness, beings of pure negation that sought not conquest but annihilation, the complete erasure of organized matter, energy, thought, and possibility from the universe. They were the anti-life that cosmic civilization had spent millennia holding at bay, contained beyond the galaxy's edge through barriers that required constant maintenance and the united effort of all transcendent species. How long before they reached the inhabited sectors? Asked former combat coordinator LYX-10, her human form that of a woman in her 40s who had spent the past year working as a public school teacher in one of Detroit's most challenging districts. The patience required to teach algebra to unmotivated teenagers had proven surprisingly similar to the strategic thinking needed for cosmic defense. At their current expansion rate, 6 months, Torvash replied grimly. Maybe less if they encounter weak resistance. The Confederation is mobilizing, but without us. He didn't need to finish the sentence. The Zephyrians had been the galaxy's first and strongest line of defense against the Devourers, their transcendent consciousness capable of reinforcing reality itself against the forces of negation. Without them, the cosmic barriers would fall like dominoes, and every living thing in the galaxy would face extinction. We have to go back, said Nixala, her human identity as Dr. Vasquez warring with her cosmic memories of duty and responsibility. We can't just sit here while entire civilizations are erased from existence. With what power? Marcus demanded, his construction workers' pragmatism cutting through cosmic urgency like a blade. Look at us. We can barely manage human lives. I spent yesterday struggling to install drywall correctly. How exactly do you propose we fight beings that can unmake reality? It was Sarah who provided the answer, her voice quiet but filled with the conviction she had learned from months of serving people who had nothing left but hope. We don't fight them as Zephyrians. We fight them as humans. The silence that followed her words was profound, filled with the weight of possibility and impossibility in equal measure. Around the table, 12 of the most powerful beings in cosmic history contemplated the idea of facing their greatest enemy while trapped in the weakest forms they had ever inhabited. Explain, Torvash said finally, his scientific mind already working through the implications. What is the one thing the Devourers cannot understand or replicate? Sarah continued, her thoughts crystallizing as she spoke. Growth through limitation. Strength through struggle. The ability to become more than what you are by embracing what you aren't. Elena leaned forward, her medical training allowing her to see the biological metaphor. They're like a cosmic autoimmune disease, they attack anything that shows organization or development. But what if we could show them something that grows stronger through being attacked? Humanity, Marcus breathed, understanding flooding his expression. We don't fight them with cosmic power. We show them what cosmic power really is, the ability to transform limitation into transcendence, weakness into strength, mortality into meaning. The plan they developed over the following weeks was simultaneously the most audacious and most humble in galactic history. They would not attempt to regain their transcendent forms or reclaim their cosmic abilities. Instead, they would use their human lives, their struggles, their growth, their capacity for hope in the face of impossible odds as a weapon against forces that existed to negate all possibility. But, first, they had work to do. The Devourers were still months away, but humanity needed to be prepared for a test they didn't even know was coming. The Zephyrians began to move through their human lives with new purpose, using every skill they had learned in exile to strengthen the communities around them. Sarah expanded her community centers programs, focusing on building networks of mutual support and resilience. Marcus organized his construction crew into a volunteer emergency response team, teaching them skills that would prove useful when ordinary systems failed. Elena began training other medical personnel in trauma care techniques that could function without advanced technology. Each of them became a seed of human potential, nurturing the very qualities that their species had once dismissed as primitive but which now represented the galaxy's best hope for survival. They taught their human neighbors to find strength in community, to derive meaning from struggle, to see hope as not just emotion but as a cosmic force capable of reshaping reality through pure determination. When the first Devourer scouts finally reached Earth's solar system, they found something they had never encountered before: a species that somehow grew stronger under pressure, that transformed every setback into opportunity, that refused to accept impossibility as final. The initial attack came without warning. Reality simply began to fray at the edges, starting in the empty spaces between planets and working inward toward the sun. The laws of physics began to stutter and fail as entropy consciousness pressed against the organized matter of the solar system. But, instead of panic, humanity responded with the stubborn creativity that had always defined them. When gravity began to fluctuate, engineers designed compensatory systems using principles that shouldn't have worked but did anyway. When electromagnetic fields started failing, communication networks rerouted through quantum entanglement effects that human science was only beginning to understand. And, at the center of it all, 12 former cosmic gods worked alongside 8 billion humans to demonstrate something the Devourers had never seen: a species that could look at the impossible and say, "Okay, so what do we do next?" The final confrontation didn't happen in space but in the basement of a Detroit community center, where Sarah Chen stood before a screen showing the approaching Devourer fleet and spoke words that would echo across the galaxy. "You want to know what humanity is? We're the species that looked at an empty universe and decided to fill it with meaning. We're the ones who took mortality and made it into motivation, who took limitation and turned it into liberation. You think you can erase us? You can't erase what we've become, because what we've become is the answer to every question you represent." Around her, her fellow exiles stood not as transcendent beings but as humans who had learned that true cosmic power comes not from rising above struggle but from diving into it completely. Marcus, his hands still rough from honest labor. Elena, her eyes bright with the satisfaction of lives saved through skill rather than miracle. Torvash, his mind sharp with knowledge earned rather than simply possessed. As the Devourer's reality negation field reached Earth, something unprecedented happened. Instead of erasing humanity, the field began to transform, infected by the very qualities it was trying to destroy. The Devourers, beings of pure negation, found themselves unable to process the concept of conscious beings who could turn weakness into strength, limitation into possibility, death into meaning. The field collapsed, not because it was defeated but because it had been convinced. For the first time in cosmic history, the Devourers began to understand that existence might be more interesting than non-existence, that growth might be preferable to entropy, that the struggle to become something greater was itself a form of transcendence worth preserving. As the crisis passed and the galaxy slowly began to understand what had happened, the Zephyrians received a message from the Cosmic Confederation. They were invited to return, to reclaim their transcendent forms and resume their role as cosmic guardians. But Sarah Chen, looking around at the humans who had become her family, at the community center that had become her temple, at the city that had become her universe, simply smiled. "Thank you," she replied to beings who spanned dimensions, "but we're exactly where we need to be." The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others, but sometimes the greatest strength comes not from destroying weakness but from embracing it completely, transforming it into something that can save not just yourself but entire galaxies. In learning to be human, the Zephyrians had remembered what it truly meant to be divine: not the power to command reality, but the courage to improve it one small act at a time. And, in the Detroit Community Center where cosmic gods now served soup to homeless humans and taught children to read, the greatest lesson of the universe continued to unfold: that transcendence is not about rising above the struggle but about diving so deep into it that you transform both yourself and everything around you in the process. The Devourers, for their part, established the first entropy rehabilitation centers on the edge of the galaxy, where beings dedicated to negation could learn the strange art of construction, guided by the example of a species that had turned their cosmic punishment into the universe's salvation. It was, everyone agreed, a much more interesting way to spend eternity than simply erasing things. In the end, the banishment had accomplished exactly what the Confederation had hoped: not punishment, but transformation. The Zephyrians had not been destroyed by their weakness but had learned to find strength in it. They had not been diminished by their limitations but had discovered that limitation itself could be a form of liberation. And humanity, unknowing partner in cosmic redemption, continued their ancient work of taking everything the universe threw at them and somehow making it into something better. Because that, after all, is what humans do: they take the impossible and make it inevitable, one stubborn day at a time.